Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. My name is Peter Hoskow. I am a principal and managing director of CCS Fundraising and a proud member of the Board of Visitors at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. On behalf of Dr. Una Osili and the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy and everyone at CCS, thank you for joining and welcome to Perspectives on Philanthropy, Giving USA 2020 and today's philanthropic landscape. I serve as an owner and board member of CCS, and we at CCS are an international fundraising, consulting, and management firm that provides focus to empowering and advancing the philanthropic efforts of nonprofit organizations across the nation and around the world. I have the privilege of overseeing our firm's operations in the central United States out of our Chicago office. As a firm, CCS partnered with more than 600 nonprofits in 2019 across all sectors. Throughout our 73-year history, CCS has had the privilege of working with leading organizations across the nation, some of which you see here on this slide, among many others. I'm delighted to see so many familiar names joining us today. CCS is proud to convene this discussion today on the state of philanthropy in America. We have done so for the past 7 years, but 2020 is certainly a unique moment for us to have a conversation with all that is going on in our world. We thank the Lilly Family School for its ongoing partnership with CCS, and most importantly, for its commitment to supporting the nonprofit sector through research and education. After today's event, CCS will host other like virtual discussions in cities around the United States. As many of you know, the release of Giving USA 2020 has been closely guarded and much anticipated. The report embargo was lifted this morning at 8 a.m. Central, meaning all of you are among the first in the country to receive this information. We're pleased to welcome Dr. Una Osili, Associate Dean for Research and International Programs at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, to present this year's findings to us. We're also privileged to have a distinguished panel here today who will offer their firsthand reactions to the report and the current state of philanthropy. Before we begin today, I would be remiss not to acknowledge the extraordinary time we find ourselves in. Over the past few months, across the nation and the world, we have experienced significant uncertainty as we faced head-on a global health pandemic and an increasing state of civil unrest driven by the realities of racial inequity and social injustices in our country. This is certainly a threshold moment. As a member of the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy Board of Visitors, I want to take just a moment to highlight the actions being taken to respond to this threshold moment. In addition to a broadened slate of poignant programming, this fall semester, the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy will begin offering COVID-19 relief scholarships to cover half tuition for any student who has experienced hardship, and will continue the commitment to scholarships for students of diverse backgrounds. You can learn more on the Lilly Family website. Today's discussion is an important one as we partner the learnings from this unparalleled time with the key data and trends from last year. We're confident that this combination of past reflection and series of present considerations will highlight some key learnings that will support the decisions to be made as we all seek to move our organizations and important causes forward. To get us started with the discussion, I'd like to introduce Dr. Una Osili. Dr. Osili is the Associate Dean for Research and International Programs at the Lilly School of Philanthropy, the world's first school dedicated to increasing the understanding of philanthropy and improving its practice worldwide. June is a very busy time for Una, and this June is no different. Many of us saw Una's testimony last Tuesday before the U.S. Congress Joint Economic Committee on charitable giving in relation to the COVID-19 crisis. Dr. Osili is an economist with significant experience in research and policy in the fields of household behavior and economic policy. Along with her team, she leads the research and publication of Giving USA, the annual report on American philanthropy. She has served as a member of several national and international advisory groups, including the African Development Bank, Social Science Research Council, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and the United Nations Development Program. She earned her BA in economics at Harvard University and MA and PhD in economics from Northwestern University. And with that, I turn it to you, Una.
Well, welcome and thank you, Peter, and thank you, CCS, for hosting us today. It's such a pleasure to be with all of you. We all recognize that we are in truly unprecedented economic and social shocks. There's great uncertainty about the economy, about our world as we know it, but we also know that during times of upheaval and turbulence, nonprofits have always provided hope, inspiration, and encouragement. So this is a great moment to come together and look at the results from Giving USA. Giving USA, as all of you know, is the longest running and most comprehensive report on American philanthropy. And this year is especially important because it's the report's 65th anniversary. So what I'd like to do is share some of the findings, the main findings, but also turn it over to my colleagues to talk about what this means for all of us. In the next slide, one of the things I would like to say is that this report is made possible by so many partnerships. We talk about collaboration in the nonprofit sector, but this is truly a team effort. Our team here at the Lilly Family School, Dr. Anna Pruitt leads that team, but then we work with colleagues throughout the sector and also depend on our colleagues from the Giving Institute and Giving USA Foundation. So thank you to all of you, and we certainly acknowledge your leadership, your partnership, and support. This year is really different from any other year. June is always a very busy month for us at the Lilly Family School, but this year we had the enormous set of challenges involved in producing a report during a pandemic. But what we now have is the ability to not just look at this moment, but compare this moment to other periods like this in history. And I'll try to touch on that as we go through the main results today. First, let's just look at some of the top line slides, a very big picture. All of you are familiar with this data, but my goal today is to sort of shed new light on these findings and why they're so important now. So let's just look at the very top line results, probably the ones that you're used to seeing every year, and I'll try to pull out some of the most central themes. So on the next slide, you'll see that we have a new level of giving now. In 2019, giving reached close to $450 billion, and individuals made up the majority of those gifts. This speaks to some of the constants we know in American philanthropy. This is a part of philanthropy that dates back to Tocqueville's observation that individuals make up the majority of American philanthropy and associational life. We also know that foundations, corporations, and bequests play a very important role. But if we were to add up the share that's attributed to individuals, about half of the foundation slice, and bequests that come from deceased individuals, we'd have something like 88% of all giving comes from individuals. Now, turning our attention to where all the giving goes, keep in mind, Giving USA tells us how much we can attribute to American philanthropy, but it also shows us where those dollars reside, where they go to. And when we turn to that side of the equation, what we see is that religion still accounts for the lion's share in terms of destination of charitable dollars, with almost 30% of all philanthropy going to religious congregations. But there's also been significant change over time. In the 1960s, religion accounted for 2/3 of American giving, and we've seen religion perhaps decline as a share, but still remain the most important destination of American giving. I also want to point out that although things look fairly similar at the surface, when we look beneath the surface, we would notice that international affairs now makes up 6% of American philanthropy, and this was a subsector that we did not start tracking until 1987. So with that as sort of a backdrop, one of the key messages as we unveil the results is that this picture provides context as we move into a period of great uncertainty with a global pandemic, with economic shocks, and then most recently, the racial unrest and the protests that we've seen around the country. Now, moving to the next slide, I'd like to do something that I have actually had to work very closely with our team to do. We do this every year. We take all the findings from Giving USA, and as you can imagine, there's a lot of information to sift through, and we try to distill this to the top 10 findings. This year, our charge is especially a bold and important one because there is so much to sift through as we share the data and as we study the data and try to put it in context. So I'll start with what I think is probably the most important takeaway from this year's report, and that's that giving has reached a new high water mark, and the growth rate of giving in this year was 4.2% in current dollars, but then adjusted for inflation, 2.4%. Now, to put this year in context, let's keep in mind that giving has averaged about 2.8% growth year over year since 1979, and the economy was very strong in 2019. But the other thing to note as we interpret the numbers is that it does look like there have been very significant shifts. And to put this in context once again, we look back at the 1970s. That's about 50 years ago. And what we've seen is the growth in individual giving is still the lion's share, but the growth in foundations. Foundations were 5.6% of all giving in the 1970s. They're now closer to 20% of all giving. Bequests have also expanded their footprint, 6.7% in the 1970s, now closer to 10%. What seems to have stayed largely the same is corporations. They accounted for about 5% of giving even back in the 1950s, and they're still about 5% of giving today. But that may be too simplistic. When we look beneath the surface, philanthropy itself has changed a lot. The field has grown, many more nonprofits than in the 1970s. The field has become more professionalized. Technology is playing a bigger role for nonprofits of all different sizes. And these are themes that we'll come back to throughout the report. The second key finding, and here this is another one where we had to really discipline ourselves to limit to just 10. The next slide tells us exactly what this new high level of giving means. So on the next slide, let's see, can we move to the next slide, please? Okay, I will continue and hope that we will have the next slide advance. One of the things we talk about often is as these numbers are unveiled, the more things change, the more they stay the same. When it comes to who's actually giving most of the gifts, it's still individuals. Although foundations have expanded their footprint, individuals are still the lion's share of American philanthropy. But that may also perhaps not tell us the full story. What we note is among those individuals, America is very different from what it looked like in the 1950s, the 1960s, or even the 1970s. We know that donors come from many more segments in terms of diversity, more diversity in terms of race, in terms of ethnicity. The United States is also, the economy is quite different. We have a much more broad-based economy, much more focused on the service sector. And this is something that we will come back to in the next slide. So the next slide really focuses on what has changed since the 1950s, the 1960s, and even the 1970s. And it's really the role of the economy. One way to make that point even stronger is to look at the giving rates over time. And if we just take the 2-year period that we've just been through, what we would see is that giving has expanded significantly since the Great Recession. Now, this one slide emphasizes the role of social and economic conditions in giving. So let's, you might ask, well, what are the bars that are in yellow on your screen? those are the recession years. And the point that I frequently make when I share this data is that you've seen one recession, you've seen one recession. And actually, giving has not always gone down during those recessionary years. What we've pointed out in this chart that you have in front of you is that the Great Recession was by far the steepest decline we have observed, that is on record, since the Great Depression, and giving declined by about 14%. It took about 7 years for giving to recover, and we reached a new high watermark in 2017. Now, when we put all this data together, the big takeaway is that context matters. Giving is influenced by social and economic conditions, and importantly, donors give when they feel financially and economically secure. So to interpret the numbers that you're all seeing today, one of the great benefits of this longitudinal data is that we can see that when the economy grows, giving grows, but giving tends to be what we call a lagging indicator, meaning the economy has to improve first before giving improves. So the next slide, I have actually tried to provide that additional context, and we show the broad set of economic indicators that mattered in 2019. So overall, you can see that 2019 was a strong year despite some of the changes we saw in 2019. Personal income grew over 4%, GDP grew also over 4%, and importantly, the stock market had a very significant growth of close to 29% year-over-year growth. If you take all these factors together, what we know is that a strong economy does lead to strong giving, and that was the case in 2019. And you might ask, well, with this as a backdrop, what should we expect going into 2020? And on the next slide, what I'd just like to show you is that we do have these indicators. We can continue to track them going into 2020. And in particular, the stock market is one of those variables that helps us understand giving. And you can see in general, as the stock market improves, giving tends to follow along, although there is a bit of a lag with that increase. Now, going to the next slide, as I mentioned, we have to really focus our top findings this year to ensure that they essentially capture the data, but also give us a sense of relevance. Importantly, the next slide points to a bigger question that many of us are asking as we look at the results this year. What is the role of philanthropy in a time of upheaval, in a time of uncertainty? We know that philanthropy accounts for 2% of GDP, and that has remained relatively stable over time. We did see increases in that percentage during the 1990s, and we did see that percentage decline during the Great Recession. The good news, though, is that Americans have shown a commitment to philanthropy in both good times and bad times, and that we've also seen philanthropy step up in many communities in times of crisis. Now, one other area that deserves close attention is what's happening beyond this broad 2%. What happens when we look underneath the surface? And if you turn to the next slide, one of the points that we have shared frequently is the power of individuals in philanthropy. At the Lilly Family School, we've been tracking giving rates in the past 2 decades. And we've noticed that giving has actually begun to shift. At the beginning of this 21st century, about 2/3 of American households gave, and we've seen that percentage decline. At the same time, average giving levels have stayed relatively stable. So we call this phenomena donors down, but dollars up, or at least holding steady. This is a concern, certainly as we move into the pandemic, as we think about what the conditions will be like in 2020 and beyond. There is the concern that how do we continue to encourage and foster this American tradition of giving, and also realize that the Great Recession did have an impact on participation rates in philanthropy. How do we continue to strengthen the sector and enlarge the participation rate? Another big theme as we think about the power of individuals in philanthropy is that today America is more diverse than ever. When we talk about individuals, we're thinking about individuals across different backgrounds. Our research from the Philanthropy panel study emphasizes that Americans of all different backgrounds participate in philanthropy. And this is actually one of the core values when we look across different groups. And in fact, one point that we make often is that more Americans give than almost any other civic activity, and certainly more Americans give than vote. And we have seen some of those trends begin to shift over time. And we all have a responsibility in ensuring that philanthropy does continue to grow and thrive, even in these very turbulent times. On the next slide, I also want to emphasize that individual giving continues to be one of the strong parts of this year's report. When we look at giving by individuals, we have actually for the first time seen this number now go over $300 billion. It's also important to note that as we mentioned earlier, that individual giving is more than ever something that all nonprofits have to focus on, in the sense that this is really what has driven some of the growth that we've seen in recent years in giving. Turning our attention to individual giving as a share of disposable income, I shared already that high level 2.1%. And you might say, well, what does that look like at an individual level? And when we compare that large share of giving by individuals to disposable income, that has also maintained a level of about 2%. And so the question and the call to action for all of us in philanthropy is, what would it take to increase giving as a share of disposable income? What would we have to do within the nonprofit sector to inspire donors to give beyond that 2%? Is this a question more for policymakers? Is there a role for policy to play in raising this percentage over 2%? Or is this something that's more of a personal commitment that all of us have to take on to raise this beyond that? One of my colleagues at the Lilly Family School several years ago asked me to actually measure what this percentage had been in other domains. In other words, what share of income are Americans spending on travel, on entertainment, on technology? And we've seen many of those shares go up over time, but giving has remained relatively flat. And as all of you know, if we look across many religious traditions, there are benchmarks about how much of income should be allocated to others. As we turn to the last few findings in the report, I just want to also mention the areas that we're tracking and seeing change taking place. I mentioned earlier at the very high level that foundations account for 17% of all giving. That's actually one of the largest shares we have on record. And if we add up bequests and foundations, they're contributing much larger shares to giving in 2019 than they have in the past. In contrast, corporations have stayed relatively constant at 5%. And the question that's often asked is, how do we explain the expansion of foundations while corporations have stayed at about 5%? And there are many ways to tackle this big question, but one explanation could be that corporations are actually changing how they give. Many more corporations are investing in direct marketing partnerships, sponsoring of events, and employee volunteer programs and other ways of supporting nonprofits. In other words, corporate giving is evolving, and corporations are actually not just giving through their charitable buckets, as it were, but through a multitude of channels. To explain foundations and their growing footprint in philanthropy, one explanation is to look at the creation of wealth and some of the stock market growth that we've seen in recent years. That has really provided an opportunity for foundations to increase their footprint. And bequests, another way to look at what's happening there is to emphasize that with an aging demographic, we've had an increasing share of philanthropy that's coming through the bequest channel. When we talk about foundations, it's important to realize that you've seen one foundation, and in particular, there are many different types of foundations. We have, for these results, partnered with Candid, and Candid has actually been able to provide this data every year, and we're very grateful for their partnership. We've seen that giving by community foundations has increased at a higher rate than some of the other types of foundations, and this has actually been a consistent trend in the last few years. Giving by independent foundations increased by 2.2%, giving by operating foundations increased by 1.3%. So overall, a strong record for foundations, and especially if you look at that 2-year growth period. The next slide, really, I wanted to spend some time on corporate giving. Keep in mind that this year, corporate giving was one of the fastest growing segments. And typically when we unpack the results, there tends to be a lot of interest in which areas of giving are growing and which ones are not growing as rapidly. We've seen corporate giving increase. We've also seen corporations become much more visible about the social causes that matter to them and the strategies that they're employing in their philanthropy. As we look at the current environment, we're also seeing corporations take very visible roles in addressing the effects of the pandemic, and also in addressing issues of racial justice and social inequality. And this trend is likely to continue. I do want to stress that one explanation for the high corporate growth number this year is the overall economic environment, but also corporate profits over the last few years have been very strong. What we've learned about corporate giving over time is that it does tend to respond to specific aspects of the particular sector that a company is in, and corporations may be less driven by the overall economy versus what's happening in their own industry within their own sphere. Another measure of how corporate giving is faring over time is to look at corporate giving as a share of pre-tax profits. And here, there has been a bit of a decline over time. In the 1980s in particular, corporate giving was above 1%. We've seen that number come down quite a bit, especially during the Great Recession. And the good news here is that we have seen a slight uptick in this year's report. So this is certainly one of the bright spots of giving in 2019 and going into the 2020 period. Now, turning our attention to where all the giving goes, the destination of giving, we call them subsectors in Giving USA. This data is very comprehensive because it allows us to see which areas of giving are growing, which ones are changing very rapidly, and where we expect to see perhaps growth in the future. Now, keep in mind, over the last few years, we've seen some subsectors perform quite strongly. And in this year's report, the ones that stand out in particular, public society benefit, which are umbrella organizations, grew at 13.1%. And when we look at these 4 subsectors, they actually experienced double-digit growth. So public society benefits, arts and culture and humanities organizations, educational institutions, and the environment. The environment is worth standing out, worth holding up as an example, because it's really one of the smaller subsectors, but has experienced resurgent growth in the last few years, particularly driven by strong interest from younger donors, also driven by public policy engagement, and a range of tools that are being employed by environmental organizations. So there's been quite a bit of innovation and quite a bit of an uptick in interest with climate change and many of these other conversations driving more interest in giving. Taken together, what we're seeing from these recipient subsectors in general is that these are subsectors that tend to do well when the economy does well, and in particular, arts and culture, the educational subsector, and public society benefit have really been beneficiaries of a strong economy. Now, turning to the next slide, the one subsector that we did not see growth in 2019 that was relatively flat and actually was a bit of a surprise was international affairs. In general, the 5-year trend for giving internationally has been positive. International affairs has recorded very significant growth since we started tracking it. But in the last year over 2019, we did see that after strong growth in 2018, we've seen a number of large-scale disasters that were domestic within US borders, and international giving tends to be affected by large-scale international disasters. So perhaps what we're starting to see is as more donors give to these domestic causes and disasters, perhaps not such an emphasis on international giving. But this is a trend we will continue to watch. And certainly the pandemic, as you all know, is not just within the US borders, but is global in nature. Now, as we round up our top 10, one of the things we do every year is try to say, what does this data tell us about the future? One aspect of giving that we've been tracking very closely is online giving. Online giving is not tabulated by Giving USA, but actually by Blackbaud, one of our partners in this project. And what we've been tracking over time is online giving as a percentage of total giving. Today, online giving stands at about 8.7% of all giving. We've seen a rise in all kinds of technology-powered giving, from giving days to more recently, not just text to give, but even gaming days. And for those of you who have young children, being able to give through TikTok and many other mobile apps. So this is the landscape that we expect to continue to change and shift, and is at a bit of an inflection point with many more nonprofits learning how to not just introduce online giving, but also provide opportunities for online engagement, virtual giving, but also virtual engagement. And if we look over time, what we'll notice is that online giving has actually been growing as a share of overall giving, and growth rates in online giving at double-digit rates compared to what we're seeing for overall giving. So the next slide sort of makes this point very apparent when we look at the shares that have taken place over time. Can we turn to the next slide, please? Okay. Well, what I will do is I think we'll make this whole slide deck available to all the participants so that you can get access to all the slides that you might have missed. In summary, I will just say that we're living in a time of incredible change, incredible uncertainty. The work through Giving USA and that all of you do is more important than ever before. We've had the opportunity to look back through Giving USA, and we've seen that even in times of great turbulence, philanthropy has played a role in providing hope, in providing inspiration, but in also lifting the voices of people who may be vulnerable, people who may not be heard. And so all of us feel that this moment more than ever creates an urgency about the work that we do and the missions that our organizations have undertaken. So with that, I'd like to turn it back over to the panelists and to the organizers.
Thank you, Una. Thanks so much for sharing those findings. You've certainly given us a lot to think about and talk about, and we were equally impressed by your graceful handling of the technical bumps in the road. So thank you. I am now thrilled to broaden the conversation here and introduce our esteemed panelists. We at CCS have had the wonderful opportunity to get to know each of these dynamic individuals through our firm's work with their organizations and witness their incredible impact on the nation's philanthropic community. So please join me in welcoming first Anna Pruitt, Managing Editor of Giving USA at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, Casey Marsh, Chief Development Officer of Feeding America, Kim Meredith, Chief Executive Officer of San Francisco General Hospital Foundation, and Robert Rosen, Director of Philanthropic Partnerships at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So thanks very much, Anna, Casey, Kim, and Rob. What we thought we'd do is carry our conversation forward in three separate themes. First, to seek your reactions to the findings and data that Una so well presented. Secondly, we'll turn to our collective perceived implications, particularly as it relates to donor engagement. And then finally, we'll round out our conversation in the time that we have with regard to your perspectives towards the future of fundraising and philanthropy. So beginning first with the general reactions to the Giving USA data, and Una, thank you again. If I may, Kim, I'll turn to you first. And as you reflect on the highlights shared from the Giving USA report, what catches your attention? Is there anything in particular that stands out to you?
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Una, for that great overview. Well, I think what stands out for me is I'm focused a bit on the individual. And I think when we think about that, actually some important trend here, that 1% of the donors gave nearly 50% of the gifts in recent years. And this trend continues to be strong. So I think stewarding the 1% is vital because this is a huge amount of aggregated capital as wealth continues to be concentrated at the top. So I think we have to think about how we unleash that capital as we move ahead and take advantage of some of the economic information that you shared, Una. With 80% of giving by individuals, the 69% who are living, and the 10% who are the bequests and passing on. I think it's important to look at that combination because that really creates a pipeline for the future. Additionally, I think when you add on to that the 17% of foundation giving, that actually 50% of those dollars are from family foundations. So you add the 69% of individuals living, the 10% who are the bequests, and then this 50% out of family foundations and this incredible growth in donor advised funds at community foundations and other charitable organizations. Then you really have an important combination there with that now 88% of individuals, as you pointed out, Una. So I think for the nonprofits who are listening in the room, having a strategy around that for your younger donors, how are your millennials and Gen X reacting to your organization if you have the 1% with a concentrated wealth? And those parents have children who might be inheriting that, who are not necessarily going to follow that same pattern of giving. What are you doing to tap into the millennials and the Gen X? I think what we see is this results-focused thinking, impact, data-driven, evidence-based type of thinking, and that's also made its way into the boomers and others who have wealth. So with the 1% plus that next generation, I think we need to be thinking about that. And very specifically, as a nonprofit, my message always is, you need to own your strategic plan and how you talk about your organization. What are your strategies, tactics, and goals? What are your activities to get you to your outputs, outcomes, and impact? And in that way, you own what you talk about to the donor so that you can be data-driven, evidence-based, and qualitative with stories also, in a way that you can actually talk about the impact that you will have. So to me, that is the most important element as you think about the 1%, but also as you think about expanding into this next generation and more diverse populations. And one place to also think about how to actually learn how to do that work is to go to the Stanford PAC's Donor Guide to Effective Philanthropy. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that.
Terrific, thank you, Kim. Rob, if I may, I'll turn to you. In your role of Philanthropic Partnerships at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, you know, from a reaction standpoint, as we all navigate COVID-19 and its impacts, are there takeaways that you've gleaned here from what Una presented and from the broader set of data that you will factor into your own strategy and you perceive will be helpful in informing the broader foundation strategy?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I appreciate the incredible effort people had to make to distill that into the top 10 findings. I'm sure there were 50 candidates, but I think it's fascinating looking at how they tie together. And, I think one point to consider is the percentage of participation in terms of how many people are actually giving. Both it's terrific that the overall number is up. I think everybody, of course, is a bit anxious about what that will look like when you release the data 1 year from now. I think the second point that's critical is to remember the overall scale of the nonprofit sector in our society. This is a very significant component of our economy, and these are organizations that are doing critical frontline work in any situation, but particularly now with all that we are collectively facing. And I think sometimes that story gets lost in the data just in terms of the overall scale. I think the third piece that is interesting looking back at the data to tie is both the amounts and where it's going, and really thinking about, going forward, is the money flowing to the areas of greatest needs, and what the data tells us about that and how it's evolving. Looking at it, and then finally, I think the point on the percentage of online donations is still surprisingly low, I think, and it shows that the field is perhaps subject to some evolution. And as we think about this, sort of wearing two hats, first as the head of Philanthropic Partnerships, our mission is to think about donors across the full spectrum of givers and what can be done to empower them to have the greatest possible impact in terms of their generosity. And I'll just note, combining some of those different factors together, one thing that we've done to address it is launch powerof.org, which is a portal to help donors with their giving in response to COVID, presenting curated opportunities where they can have tremendous impact and help them along that pathway. It doesn't have to be the one place they go, but it is a great way to get started. And behind that, working with the United Philanthropy Forum, we've created the Momentum Fund to try and shore up the infrastructure of community foundations and women's foundations and others that are helping channel resources to the areas of greatest need. And so it's important that we think, holistically about the data and the numbers and what they tell us, and where we may have collectively as a sector the ability to have a positive impact, not just in terms of actual dollars given, but also to make sure that they're flowing to areas that can have the greatest impact in terms of the greatest need.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks for mentioning those resources. Clearly very important to channel and catalyze the generosity that's flowing at present. Anna, let me turn to you. As you think of philanthropy in the year ahead, and for the next 5 years for that matter, what trends do you think are most important from this Giving USA 2020 report for us to focus on?
Thanks, Peter. I think that to begin, one of the things that we can take away is that when the economy is strong, giving grows broadly, and that's what we saw last year. One of the exciting things is that we saw 8 of 9 subsectors grow, and that's very common when we have that strong economic growth, because it's that expressive component of philanthropy where people give a lot to what they care about. Now, we're going from a lot of knowns to a lot of unknowns in this 2020 background. Something we've heard a number of different people say is that largely giving is still done by individuals, especially when we think of bequests and family foundations. Even within that, though, there's something more that we can think about. So, for instance, giving by donor-advised funds. We have some research from some Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy alumni that tells us that giving from donor-advised funds actually went up during the Great Recession. And we're interested to see whether that trend will continue in the future. Also, under bequests, which, as we know from Renee's presentation, have actually increased as a share of giving over time. are at quite a complicated category. So within planned giving, there's a number of different options, including making qualified charitable distributions from an IRA, giving from an insurance policy, and some of those less known but still very important parts of planned giving. Some recent research from the Giving USA Foundation actually found that about half of people who had a bequest had another form of planned gift as well. So as we see that share increasing, it's important to remember that people are being as strategic as they possibly can. They're looking to make the greatest impact, and they're using all of their different resources, all of their assets to do so. Another thing I want to point out is not only with that online giving number, yes, it's still under 10% of total giving, but another way to think about that is that there's often a lot of engagement. So some of the places where we saw double-digit growth over on the uses side, education, arts, environment, a lot of those organizations tend to do well in terms of engaging donors for things like Giving Tuesday. So for instance, like the University of Michigan has a Giving Tuesday event that doesn't actually look at the total dollars given. They try to increase the number of gifts every year, and they've been successful in doing that over time. We also see things like sustainer revenues that can play a role in some of those types of organizations. And it will be interesting to see how those different factors play a role, because we also know that education and arts in particular were hard hit by the last recession. And we are interested to see how things move forward. Of course, there's, as everyone has said, still a great number of unknowns, and we are watching all of those carefully. One bright point I would bring up is that Rob just brought up the question of, do people respond to the areas of greatest needs? One thing we know from the last recession is that giving to human services organizations actually increased in 2008 and 2009, even when we adjust for inflation. So there is a sense that donors respond to areas of need. And I think that that's going to be very important going forward.
Anna, thank you. Let's shift to our second line of discussion, where we're wanting to talk about implications on donor engagement, springing from the trends captured in the Giving USA report. And Casey, I'll come to you first. You've shared that Feeding America has experienced an amazing increase in philanthropy, particularly over these last several weeks and months. It's been inspiring to see communities rally behind this cause. Can you tell us a little bit more about your approach to engaging with corporate donors in particular and seeking all types of gifts, in-kind gifts during this time? What changes have you made to your overall strategies, and what tactics have been in particular impactful?
Yeah, thank you. COVID-19, I think for Feeding America in particular, has kind of presented a perfect storm, or a triple whammy of increased demand that we're seeing, as well as declines in donations of food and disruptions to the charitable food system's operating model. So despite these challenges, the network, the Feeding America network, which is the largest charitable food assistance network in America, with 200 food banks and 60,000 agency partners in a federated model, has remained really strong and resilient. And the way that we've approached that, especially during this critical, difficult time, is in part through public-private partnerships for overcoming the challenges that COVID-19 has created for the charitable food system. This has always been a part of our approach. So private industry, nonprofit, faith-based organizations, and volunteers, all in tandem with significant government support and cooperation with our food banks themselves and federal, state, and local government agencies, has been really important. But when it comes to the demand, even before COVID-19, we saw in the USA about 37 million of our neighbors were food insecure. And what we're estimating is that about another 17 million could be food insecure in 2020 as a result of the crisis. So that takes us to about 1 in every 6 people, which is just overwhelming, but we're seeing the response from a lot of different types of donors. Specifically, Peter, you asked about corporate donors. The pandemic really drove awareness of Feeding America, leading to a huge influx of gifts from new corporate partners, as well as our existing partners who increased their gifts. The team that processes our inbound inquiries for corporate partnerships received 1,800 calls between the beginning of March and the end of May. And our typical annual volume is around 1,100 calls, if that gives you a sense of the increase. It was quite significant, but our approach to those donors has been to build really holistic, multifaceted relationships. And to us, that means in part buy-in from their leadership, philanthropic support, cause marketing and brand partnerships, in-kind donations, local collaboration with the food banks, and really co-designing innovative approaches to address the food insecurity in our country. So this overarching philosophy has really served us well during COVID-19 for both new and existing partnerships. We really pivoted to ask our donors to contribute to a pooled fund during COVID-19, which was used to provide funding for food banks. And we granted that out and distributed that at 100%. So nothing was retained by Feeding America National. And we also offered our partners the opportunity to direct their support through the fund to specific markets where their businesses were thriving or that were important to them as corporate partners. So we did need to pivot quite a bit, especially as the influx to Feeding America came in. But so far, we've done that successfully and hope to continue that.
Thanks, Casey, and thanks for your leadership in this threshold moment as this critical story evolves. Kim, shifting the focus to individual giving, as in years past, engaging with individual donors continues to be a critical area of focus for nonprofit organizations. As organizations and their fundraising arms rise to the call to action presented by COVID-19, how has your approach to engaging with individual donors changed? What best practices should we have top of mind?
Right. Well, I think most important, I loved what Casey said about co-designing, and I think it's really being in conversation with donors. I think in the time of COVID and with this deep solidarity against systemic racism, we're seeing that donors are reassessing their priorities, both for urgent needs as a food bank, but systemic change. And I see that coming from both roles. As my second day as CEO at the foundation, but 11 years at Stanford PACS, we just had our May board meeting for Stanford PACS. And what I heard was a combination of those things. One, Laura Arriaga Andreessen made a $2 million gift for urgent needs at the hospital. So with my San Francisco General Hospital Foundation lens, I see the need for investing in science and healthcare innovations and strengthening our public healthcare systems. Also, Darren Walker was at the table, and he was talking about digging in and creating this new bold $1 billion fund for COVID. And again, COVID focused on systemic inequality, access to healthcare in that case. Or Kathy Kwan, who had won the national, the National Philanthropy Day Award in 2019. She was talking to all of her grantees and removing restrictions, saying, I've invested in you as an organization. Do you need more general operating support? So those questions around general operating support, multi-year, removing restrictions. So we heard all of that around our table. And then I think that also gets into this trend around donor advised funds, this half the DAF that Jennifer and David Risher started here out of the San Francisco Bay Area. And in fact, at the San Francisco Foundation, DAF giving increased 298%. So for our regional listeners, in the past 5 months. On a national basis, Fidelity saw an increase of 30%, Vanguard and Schwab 50%, Goldman Sachs Philanthropy Fund 26%. So Money is coming out of donor advised funds, so I would focus on the donors and the organizations that are thinking about that. At the same time, do not forget the other 50% of gifts who are just made by everyday people. And the wonderful article that was co-authored by a group of 12 Indiana University faculty for SSIR last August on the 8 myths of philanthropy, talking about how do you work with the African American community, the Latinx community, women and millennials. So do not forget them when you're talking about the 1%. And then this whole question, I think Giving Tuesday had great success and raised 90% of what they do in December in May this year. So the question that I'll end with, and again, going to your donors, talking to them and listening. She said, I spent all of my 2020 allocation on COVID. Now what? We've got all of these other social justice issues. And so now what do I need to think about? So more advancing 2021, giving multi-year. So those would be some of my observations from individuals.
Great advice, Kim. And as the adage says, one of the best forms of stewardship is to ask, right? Just great foundational advice. I think we're going to take the liberty here of going a few minutes over. Rob, I'll pivot to you with the perspective of a foundation at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Though your role is with Philanthropic Partners, the foundation's a funder and of course is experiencing the impact of COVID-19 in a different way. Can you just tell us a bit more about that and offer some perspective for the participants today?
Sure, and it really does build on what Casey and Kim said and earlier in his presentation. The listening with empathy and having an active dialogue between funder and recipient organization is critical in this. I don't know that there's a one-size-fits-all approach, but making sure that from the donor perspective, obviously the areas of need are so extraordinary that it is incredibly complex in terms of thinking about immediate relief versus long-term programmatic efforts and getting that balance right. And there isn't necessarily a specific roadmap that applies evenly across all different areas of programmatic strategies. Just from the Gates experience of in addition to COVID, our core global health priorities and the implications that COVID is having on those. There's the balance, of course, that every funder wants to strike in terms of thinking about short-term versus critical long-term strategic approaches. And so what I would just encourage is echoing the previous comments of making sure that there's an active, candid dialogue about what can happen this year and what are things from the implementer perspective that may have to get altered in terms of priorities. We're living in a very dynamic environment, and we're not collectively going to be able to respond in a meaningful, dynamic way unless we have those honest conversations.
Thanks, Rob. And Anna, we'll turn to you for the lone voice on the future with no pressure delivered. But as we pivot and soon to conclude our conversation here, future perspectives on philanthropy, let me just ask you if you could share some advice for the nonprofit and fundraising leaders on this call. How should we be applying the learnings from Giving USA at our respective organizations? What other counsel might you offer to this group as we navigate these historic and in many ways uncertain times?
I think that everyone has already expressed really the most important thing, which is connection and that relationship piece. As I said before, people responded in the Great Recession by giving more to human services organizations. We know now that, as others have said, foundations are looking to give more. Individuals are looking to make major gifts as they see all of the needs that are around, that are coming up throughout 2020 and probably will continue to do so. So I think I can't say it any better than that, other than just that it's important that we continue to have hope, as I think I am personally an optimist. I think if you're in the fundraising profession, you're probably an optimist as well. And I would also just encourage you anyone listening to this, please reach out to me. We here at the School of Philanthropy are a resource, and we want to help you reach your goals. We want to give you the information that you need. So please also reach out to us.
Anna, thank you. Una, a special thanks to you and to each of our panelists. My great appreciation, and on behalf of the board and every team member at CCS, we're grateful for your participation today. For all participants, the recording from today's webinar will be distributed via email later today. We're also pleased to share an exclusive discount code to purchase the 2020 Giving USA report. Just use the discount code CCS and you'll receive 30% discount. On behalf of CCS Fundraising, the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, and our presenters, we thank you all for joining us today, and we wish you the very best today and in the weeks and months that remain. Thank you all for joining.